Have you ever listened to the silence of a forest at night? Not the peaceful silence of crickets and the occasional breeze, but a silence so deep, so absolute, it feels like the world itself is holding its breath. I've always been drawn to the edges of things, the liminal spaces. That's probably why my feet led me there, down a barely there path on a starless October night. The air was damp, every breath heavy with the scent of decaying leaves and something older. It wasn't fear, not then, more a tingling in my spine. The same feeling you get standing at the edge of a cliff, the strange mix of exhilaration and the prickle of danger. With every step, those once familiar woods became something alien. Ordinary shapes, a twisted root, a cluster of ferns, transformed in the scant moonlight, their shadows stretching out like grasping hands. My pulse throbbed in my ears, not in rhythm with my footsteps, but a counterpoint to them. Tap, tap, thump, thump, tap, tap. Was the forest's silence amplifying my own heartbeat? Or was that something else? Then came the whispers, not in words, but in the faint rustle of leaves where the wind couldn't reach, the creak of a branch under no discernible weight. They danced around me, playful at first. It was almost like the forest was giggling at my unease. But as I went deeper, the giggling turned into something colder. Icy fingers traced along the back of my neck. A twig snapped with enough force that it had to be a startled animal, but nothing ran. I found myself craving those sounds, anything to break the unnatural hush that had fallen over the place. The trees were thinning out now, the darkness less complete, and I knew I was nearing the edge of the woods. What I didn't know is that a different kind of darkness was waiting for me. A few more steps, and the ground fell away, leaving me staring out at an old, overgrown graveyard. It wasn't the crumbling tombstones that made me gasp, though those were unsettling enough. It was the feeling of eyes boring into my very soul, not from any specific direction, but from the space itself, from every shadowed corner of those forgotten graves. It was as though the air itself was watching, waiting for me to take one more step. That's when the dread bloomed, a wave of nausea and primal fear, unlike anything I'd ever felt. It was unbearable. Yet, beneath it, something twisted and curious stirred. It was like a moth drawn to the flame, a terrifying fascination with the darkness that pulsed out from the burial ground. It whispered, promising answers, stories, maybe even power, if I dared to step inside. I couldn't. Something stronger than fear held my feet in place. Whether it was common sense, a lingering shred of self-preservation, or some unseen guardian, I don't know. What I do know is I spent the rest of that night curled at the base of a tree on the forest's edge, listening to the terrible quiet of the graveyard, unable to break its watchful gaze. That was my initiation into the world of the in-between, of liminal spaces. It's hard to explain the draw of such places, even with the fear fresh in mind. We're told the world is neatly divided, the known and the unknown, the safe and the dangerous, life and death. But the lines are far blurrier than we like to admit. And within those spaces, well, let's just say sometimes the veil thins and things slip through. The term liminal space gets thrown around a lot lately. Trendy coffee shops, the background image on a meme about existential angst. It's become almost meaningless. But there's a reason the concept of liminality has always held power, a reason beyond internet aesthetics. Think of the word itself. Limen is Latin for threshold. A true liminal space is not just a weird-looking place. It's a place of passage, an uncomfortable in-between. A doorway between rooms still holds something of both spaces it connects. Likewise, a liminal space retains echoes of what was and hints of what might come next. These places don't necessarily have to be terrifying in the traditional haunted house way. They're eerie because they're disorienting. Our brains crave patterns, the comfort of the familiar. When you're waiting for a flight in a deserted airport terminal at 4 a.m., the rows of empty seats, the flickering fluorescent lights, the echoing announcements feel wrong. It's the same airport, but stripped of its usual context. It becomes other. Sometimes that otherness is thrilling in a safe way. Ever explored an abandoned building? There's a somber beauty to seeing something designed for living slowly being reclaimed by nature. You can almost feel the history seep out of the peeling paint, the broken stairs. The echoes of laughter and arguments linger beneath the dust. Each room seems like a moment frozen in time, begging the question, what happened here? That question is the core of why I'm drawn to the liminal. It's not just about the unsettling atmosphere. It's about the yearning for the truth behind it. What stories are locked away in a dusty old hotel room? What secrets seep from the fog-shrouded cliffs where lighthouses stand guard? Did something truly terrifying happen within the silent halls of an abandoned hospital? Or is the greatest horror the one our imaginations conjure? That's the danger of liminal spaces. That silence, that blank canvas, it invites projection. We project our hopes, our fears, and those buried bits of ourselves we'd rather stay hidden upon them. Sometimes we project outward, the unseen figures lurking in the shadows, the whispers carried on non-existent winds. Other times, the shadows take shape from within us, and we confront the darkest parts of our own nature out there in the in-between. You see, the true horror of liminal spaces isn't always what's lurking within them, but what might be lurking within ourselves. It's those uncomfortable truths we normally try to avoid: loneliness, the inevitability of change, the fear that we are, perhaps, on the precipice of something unknown and irreversible. The graveyard in the woods wasn't the first liminal space I'd stumbled across, but it was the one that cracked the door open, the one that made me realize there's a power in these places. They force us to confront the fact that reality isn't as solid as we pretend it is. They're a constant reminder that the boundaries we so carefully construct between the normal and the strange, the living and the dead, are more fragile than we realize. Perhaps that's why some of us are so compelled by the liminal. We chase the mystery, the thrill of the unknown, the tingle down the spine that reminds us, if only for a moment, that things are not always as they appear. The obsession started long before that night of watchful tombstones. I must have been about 10 when I found it, tucked away down a dirt lane, half hidden by overgrown weeds that reached like grasping hands. My family called it the spooky house, and my brother had filled my head with ghost stories, but that couldn't quell the thrill of discovery. We weren't supposed to go near it. Adults would whisper its name, the Carmichael place, in hushed tones, hinting darkly at tragedy. That only fueled my curiosity. And one humid summer afternoon, when my family was distracted, I slipped away. The front door was long gone, replaced by a gaping, shadowy maw. I stepped through, heart pounding not with fear, but with the illicit rush of the forbidden. The air inside was a decade stale. Motes of dust danced in the slant of sunlight, piercing a broken window, painting golden streaks on the peeling wallpaper and tattered carpet. Every rustle of leaves outside made me jump. But it was a delicious fear, something I'd chosen, a game I was playing against myself. Each room was a time capsule. An ancient TV squatted like a blind beetle in the living room, its rabbit ear antenna askew. Upstairs, faded school pictures grinned from a crumbling dresser. A child's tea set laid out on a rotting bedspread. There was an odd intimacy to it, like I was barging in on a life half-lived, interrupted in its most natural state. But intimacy quickly curdled into unease as the sun dipped lower. Strange tricks of light and shadow made the peeling floral wallpaper seem to slither. The grinning faces in those photographs turned faintly sinister. And the silence. It wasn't just the absence of sound. It was an oppressive hush, the feeling of 100 untold stories held within the rotting walls. It seemed to seep into my skin, making my hair stand on end. The silence was broken by the crunch of my foot on something brittle and surprisingly loud. I froze. For a heartbeat, every ghost story my brother had ever told me flickered to life. But when I looked down, all I saw were shards of what had once been a delicate porcelain teacup scattered on the moldy carpet. Still, that moment, the echo of that tiny noise in the suffocating quiet, it was my first true sense of how fragile the line is between safety and something else. I retreated that day, driven out by the encroaching twilight and the growing certainty I wasn't alone. But the allure of the Carmichael house was firmly planted in my mind. It was the start of a strange fascination. From then on, I sought out the abandoned. There was the crumbling water tower on the edge of town, a rusty metal skeleton against the endless prairie sky. Climbing it sent waves of fear mingled with adrenaline through me. Up there, wind whistling through the broken slats. It felt like anything was possible. You could almost swear you were the first person to ever see the town sprawled out below from such a height. And who knew what critters hid in the murky water tank? The possibilities prickled deliciously along my skin. Then there was the deserted farmhouse, its collapsed roof gaping like a rotted mouth. The scent of decay hung thick there, not just mold, but something deeper, an animal scent that hinted at creatures unseen. Every floorboard creaked in warning as I tiptoed across, imagining with nauseating clarity my foot plunging into empty space below. And my favorite, the old, overgrown drive-in movie theater. The screen was cracked, the speakers long since ripped away, but the rows of rusty metal poles where cars would once park still maintained a sense of spectral order. That one was my go-to for late-night adventures with friends. We'd spread blankets between the poles, the moon, our projector, and take turns telling the spookiest stories we could come up with. There was a safety in that self-inflicted fear, the knowledge we could pile back into our cars and leave the liminal space behind. These places became my cathedrals, strange temples to forgotten lives and lost time. Each one a silent dare to touch the edge of something unknown, something a bit dangerous. Why this fascination with decay and neglect? I still don't have all the answers to that. Maybe it was the way the mundane world seemed to fall away, leaving something raw and real exposed. Maybe it was that sense of time standing still. You could almost trick yourself into the feeling that these places existed outside linear time altogether. Of course, there were times when the trick played itself on me, when the stillness became oppressive, the decay turned from melancholy to menacing. Then the whispers in the silence wouldn't be ones of invitation, but of warning, and my imagination would run riot. Were those footsteps in the distance, or the settling of the collapsing house? Was that a shadow, or some half-seen creature watching me? That fine line between thrill and terror, it was always there, and I danced across it with reckless abandon. The pull of liminal spaces isn't always about crumbling architecture and fading lives. Sometimes it's about something vaster, the liminality between our world and the endless expanse of the universe. For that, you head to the desert. I made the pilgrimage after years of fascination with the most famous liminal spot in the American Southwest. The name itself sounds ripped out of a B-movie, Area 51. But it wasn't so much the rumors of hidden alien craft that drew me, but the sheer otherness of the landscape. The feeling that out there, in that desolate stretch of sand and rock, reality got a bit thinner. The drive itself was unsettling. Hours with nothing but cracked two-lane highway, bleached bones by the roadside, and mountains rising like specters in the shimmering distance. You shed the familiar bit by bit, leaving it in your rear view, along with any hint of civilization. Signs warning against trespassing and the vague threat of armed guards did little to dispel the growing unease. This wasn't just some roadside curiosity. This was a place the government went to great lengths to keep hidden. A place where the very air seemed to buzz with secrets. Of course, I stayed on the legal side of the fence, pulling over near the kitschy alien-themed diner that marks the closest you can get without risking arrest. It felt anticlimactic at first, this stark desert beauty broken by a tourist trap. But even sipping a watered-down soda under the faux gaze of a bug-eyed alien statue, I felt undeniably on edge. The fence marking the edge of Area 51 territory was disappointingly mundane, barbed wire and threatening signs. But beyond it, the desert stretched on, empty and merciless. You could feel the weight of countless eyes on you, unseen guards hidden in the folds of the hills, their telescopes trained not on the heavens, but on the curious few who dared to stop. And then there was the sky. Daytime. It was a canvas of impossible blue, stretching so far, it seemed to curve with the earth itself. It dwarfed you, leaving you feeling utterly insignificant. This wasn't a place shaped by human hands. It felt indifferent to our very existence, which was as thrilling as it was terrifying. People talk about UFO sightings in that area, the flashes of light, the strange craft moving at impossible speeds. I never saw anything so definitive. But I get it now, how after hours in that desolate expanse, your mind starts playing tricks. The sun paints mirages on the horizon, and every flicker of a distant bird looks like something far more extraordinary. You start to believe the desert isn't empty at all, but filled with watchers, with things just outside your understanding. That night, I camped far from any town lights, the desert wind my only lullaby. I lay on my back and stared up at the impossible blaze of stars, out in that vast emptiness, surrounded by land steeped in tales of unexplained phenomena. A strange shift happened. Growing up, the stars were comforting, points of light in a friendly darkness. That night, they were cold, remote. I felt less like an observer of the universe and more like something being observed. I'd love to tell you something extraordinary happened then. A glowing orb descended, or I awoke with some impossible knowledge seared into my brain. But I didn't. What did happen was more subtle, and perhaps more profound. A shooting star, the only one I saw all night, ripped across the sky. But instead of the usual fleeting wish, it left in its wake a deep sense of wrongness. The star had moved, yes, but it had also twitched somehow, changing direction mid-flight in a way that defied all the laws of physics as I understood them. Hallucination? Desert madness? Or had I truly seen a sliver of something impossible? In that liminal space, beneath that vast, uncaring sky, I'll never truly know. The possibility lingers, an itch under my skin. The disquieting reminder of how little we understand the boundaries of our own world. Places like Area 51, they aren't just liminal in a geographical sense. They represent the boundary between the known and the stubbornly, persistently inexplicable. People are drawn to them for various reasons. Curiosity seekers, conspiracy theorists, those desperate for any proof that we're not alone in the universe. Maybe there are no aliens hidden in those government bunkers. Maybe the strange lights have earthly explanations. But the power of the place, the way it forces you to question not just your perception, but the very nature of reality itself, that's undeniable. And as I drove away the next morning, that stretch of desert in my rearview mirror, I felt forever changed. The world seemed a bit bigger, a bit more filled with tantalizing shadows. And the knowledge that I might never have all the answers was oddly comforting. If abandoned places tap into the mystery of what was, then haunted spaces expose the wounds of what should never have been. They're not just spooky due to creaky floors and flickering lights. They're heavy with the weight of sorrow, pain, and unresolved violence. These emotions seep into the very air, creating a liminality that transcends the purely physical. I've sought out my fair share of these haunted places, not for the cheap thrills ghost hunting shows offer, but for the lingering echoes of trauma. There's a somber fascination in it, maybe even a compulsion to bear witness. The Waverly Hills Sanatorium is one place I won't easily forget. Opened over a century ago as a tuberculosis hospital, it stands on a desolate hilltop, a sprawling, decaying testament to human suffering. Just the outline of it against the gray Kentucky sky sends a shiver down your spine. You tour what's left, the cramped wards, the echoing solarium, the infamous body chute, where the deceased were discreetly moved under the cover of night. The tour guide rattles off statistics. How many thousands entered these doors? How many never left alive? But the true horror isn't in the numbers. It's in the small, chilling details. A child-sized wheelchair abandoned in a hallway. The way the paint peels in patterns that look uncannily like grasping hands. The operating room, with its stark metal tables and trays of rusted, unsettling instruments. In places like Waverly Hills, there's a palpable shift in the very atmosphere. Even with a tour group shuffling along, even in bright daylight, it's there. A coldness that has nothing to do with temperature, but prickles against your exposed skin like electricity. A silence that crackles with unseen energy, like the moment right before a storm breaks. People claim to see figures in the windows, to hear voices where there should be no one. Honestly, I didn't experience any of that. My personal horrors were far more subtle. There was the moment on the 5th floor when a door slammed shut on the far end of the deserted corridor. The tour group froze, guide included. The draft was unmistakable, but there wasn't a breeze that day, and none of the windows were open. Then there's the lingering nausea as I listened to the stories of the experimental treatments, the fear radiating off those walls more potently than any ghostly moan. And let's not forget the shadows that seemed to dance at the edge of my vision. Were they tricks of the rotting architecture? Or was something older, born from despair itself, peering back at me? It's easy to dismiss all this as overactive imagination, our brains trying to make sense of unsettling surroundings. And maybe it is. But here's the thing about liminal spaces. By their very nature, they invite interpretation. It's where what we can objectively prove fades into what we desperately need to believe. History backs this up. Waverly isn't haunted just by the ghosts of its patients. It's haunted by an era when illness was a terrifying, isolating, and often shame-filled experience, where the treatments themselves were sometimes as monstrous as the disease they were meant to cure. You feel those echoes of pain in every bare room. The same applies to battlefields, prisons, sites of violent crimes. Yes, ghost stories abound in those places, but what chills me more is the simple knowledge of what took place there. It's impossible to stand in a damp dungeon cell and not imagine the terror of those who were chained within. You can practically smell the desperation, and that fear doesn't always fade with time. It lingers, staining the stones, soaking into the very atmosphere. This, I think, is the true nature of a haunting. It's not always about disembodied spirits, but the emotional residue of trauma clinging to a space. These sites of pain, of loss, they become liminal because time itself seems to break down within their boundaries. The past doesn't stay safely in the past. It bleeds into the present in those moments of uncanny coldness, the fleeting shadows, the echoes of voices carried on a silent wind. The debate rages on whether ghosts are real in the literal sense. But places like Waverly Hills lead me to believe in a different kind of haunting, the lingering imprint of sorrow and violence on the very fabric of reality. The living and the dead aren't always so easily divided as we like to think. Even if you don't see a ghost, standing in those places forces you to confront the uncomfortable truth that history's cruelty leaves scars that linger long after the physical traces are gone. The most terrifying liminal spaces aren't always found out in the world. Sometimes they exist within our own minds. Nowhere is this more evident than in the chilling dance between sanity and monstrousness that defines the serial killer. From Ted Bundy's chilling charm mask to John Wayne Gacy's disturbing normalcy as Pogo the Clown, Their stories defy comprehension for a reason. They expose something deeply uncomfortable, that the line separating acceptable behavior from the utterly abhorrent is far thinner than we want to admit. The serial killer embodies a perversion of liminality. They exist on the threshold between human and something other. It's tempting to think of them only as monsters, to divorce them from the very concept of humanity. That's comforting for us, allows us to feel safe in our moral convictions. But the truth is far more insidious. Take Dennis Rader, the BTK killer, a devoted family man, an active church member, a local government worker, the epitome of ordinary. Yet within that facade lurked a darkness that led to the torture and murder of 10 people. He compartmentalized to a horrifying degree, living his everyday life mere steps from the boundary of his own depravity. He saw the rules that govern society not as moral absolutes, but as an inconvenience, a game to be played. This is the true hallmark of the liminal mind. It's not just about lacking empathy, though that's certainly a large part of it. It's the ability to shift so completely between the socially acceptable and the unimaginable that they almost cease to be the same person, but two sides of a twisted coin. Experts analyze the psychology of serial killers in various ways. Some cite childhood trauma, the thrill of power, or the desire to fulfill sadistic fantasies. While these may be elements, they don't fully explain the chasm between a functional life and the urge to murder. The mind of someone like Jeffrey Dahmer is liminal in its disconnection from consequence. Dahmer didn't just kill, he experimented, twisted his victims into something both alive and horrifyingly not, pushing the very boundaries of existence itself. This perversion, this blurring of life and death, pleasure and pain, control and utter chaos, is what chills us so deeply. It reminds us that the darkness is never truly external, that it resides in potential within us all. Our internal landscapes are far less solid than we imagine, peppered with impulses and buried desires we'd rather not confront. Most of us have a strong moral compass, social ties, and an understanding of right and wrong that keeps those darker elements in check. But the serial killer inhabits the shadowy borderland where those limitations don't exist. Their crimes expose the raw potential of the untethered mind, one where the whispers of impulse and the fascination with destruction are allowed to grow unchecked. It's a sobering reflection. If sanity can be viewed as a spectrum rather than a rigid state, where on that line do we each fall? Are there circumstances, however extreme, that could nudge us closer to the precipice? We pray that the answer is never. But the stories of otherwise ordinary people turned killers serve as an unnerving reminder of how precariously we balance on that boundary. And that's the horror of the liminal mind. It isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself with howls or ghostly moans. It's chillingly silent, hidden behind vacant smiles and the routines of everyday life. We've all felt brushes with our own shadowy impulses, a flicker of white-hot rage that shocks us, an intrusive thought so disturbing we push it away instantly. The serial killer is the monstrous extension of that. The what if made horrifically real. By studying these monstrous figures, we're not just studying them, we're forced to study ourselves. We see the line between civility and savagery laid bare, It's a line drawn in our brains, not on a map. And perhaps the scariest thing about liminal spaces, both mental and physical, is the question they leave lingering. Is that boundary as strong as we think? We may never have definitive answers to what creates a serial killer, what transforms a seemingly normal person into a creature of unspeakable horror. But by examining the liminal space in which they exist, we are forced to confront unsettling truths. That there is darkness within all of us, that the monsters of our nightmares are, in disturbing ways, extensions of our own potential. And the world's darkest corners reflect the ones we dare not illuminate within our own hearts. I want to preface this by saying, I'm a skeptic at heart. When it comes to the paranormal, I crave hard evidence, logical explanations. However, there are cracks in my skepticism, moments within those liminal spaces where doubt seeped in. These aren't the most dramatic, but perhaps because of that, they're the most persistent. There's the abandoned farmhouse where my friends and I hung out as reckless teenagers. Crumbling walls, rotting beams, the usual. But there was one upstairs room we always avoided. It wasn't any more decrepit than the rest, but a feeling of wrongness clung to the air in that room, cold and heavy, like a hand settling on your shoulder. We convinced ourselves there was a rational explanation, a draft, something nesting in the attic. But stepping across that threshold, every time, my rational mind went silent, replaced by a primal urge to flee. One night, fueled by bravado, or perhaps stupidity, we decided to face it. Armed with flashlights and a creeping dread, we entered the room. It was as unremarkable as ever. Dusty floorboards, cobweb-draped windows. Nothing that should have set off such internal alarm bells. We almost laughed at ourselves for being spooked until we heard the noise. It wasn't loud, just a faint scratching sound from near the ceiling. Any relief we felt instantly withered away. Mice were the likely culprit, but as we flashed our lights around the peeling plaster walls, we couldn't find the source. The scratching continued, rhythmic, methodical, and directly above us. We bolted, our brave experiment cut short. Rationality returned as we stumbled down the stairs. But to this day, I wonder, what if? Then there was the night in the old Victorian house, converted into a B&B, quaint on the outside, full of unsettling creaks and whispers on the inside. I was alone, tucked into a room with floral wallpaper and a bed that felt far too big. Sleep evaded me. Not from fear exactly, but from a prickly sense of anticipation, like the house itself was waiting to reveal some hidden secret. I must have dozed off eventually, because I was jarred awake by the sound of footsteps right outside my door. Heavy, deliberate footsteps that paused directly outside, then moved away. Springing up, I flung open the door, expecting to confront a late-arriving guest or an overeager cleaning person. The empty hallway stared back at me. Every door was closed, every corner empty. I checked all the rooms on the floor, feeling increasingly foolish. Sleep was clearly off the table after that. The next morning, over the aggressively cheerful breakfast, I cautiously asked the innkeeper if there'd been anyone else on my floor the night before. She looked startled, then adamant. I'd been the only guest booked on that side of the house. The most chilling one happened out in the harsh beauty of the desert. I was camping solo, miles from any town. That night, the silence was so absolute, it became its own kind of noise. Sleep was elusive. Around 3 a.m., I lay awake, staring at the canvas of my tent, illuminated by moonlight. That's when I saw it. A shadow, darker than the darkness, slipped across the tent wall. It was humanoid in shape, impossibly tall, and it moved with an unnatural fluidity. Terror constricted my throat. Whatever it was, it had been close enough to touch the tent. Logically, it had to be a trick of the moonlight, some contorted shadow cast by a rock or a bush. When dawn finally broke, I tore out of there, desperate for the comforting normalcy of a highway rest stop. To this day, I can't fully explain it away. Do I believe these experiences were supernatural? Honestly, I don't know. What stays with me isn't so much the events themselves, but how they altered my perception of reality. Each time, there's always that sliver of doubt, an uncomfortable awareness of the limits of my understanding. The aftermath of these incidents isn't a constant fear, but a lingering wariness. A heightened attention to the edges of perception, the fleeting movements in the corner of my eye, the sounds that seem to exist just below the range of normal hearing. I've started to think that the veil between the normal and the something else is far less solid than we like to convince ourselves. More importantly, those moments changed my relationship with liminal spaces themselves. They're undeniably alluring, but I approach them with a new sense of respect. A healthy dose of caution tempers the thrill, because I've learned they aren't just passive backdrops for our fears and fantasies. They have a power of their own. They act as catalysts, magnifying the unknown both in the world around us and deep within ourselves. They invite us to question what we see, what we believe, and who we might be capable of becoming if we crossed the line into those in-between spaces. I likely won't stop seeking out the liminal, but now I tread a bit more carefully, aware that the echoes of those experiences linger. And perhaps that lingering unease is the point. Each strange encounter deepens my understanding that the world we inhabit is far more mysterious, far more fragile than we allow ourselves to believe. Perhaps you don't believe in ghosts, in the shadows that lurk just beyond sight. Maybe you write off the chill that crawls down your spine as an old building settling, the creaks and whispers as the tricks of an overactive imagination. I understand that. Sometimes I envy those who can maintain that certainty. But liminal spaces invite us to reconsider, don't they? They remind us how little we truly understand about the world and about the unsettling things lurking at the edges of our own minds. Perhaps, like me, you'll start noticing them more. That stretch of road where the trees seem to lean inward, that neglected room in your own house where a shadow falls just a bit too long. If you feel the draw, heed my words. Tread carefully. These spaces of in-between, they demand respect. Remember, they represent thresholds. There's a reason ghost stories revolve around doorways, mirrors, and midnight. Those moments of transition, when the boundaries blur and things can slip through. Delve into liminality at your own peril. It may offer glimpses into hidden truths, a heightened awareness of the world around you, but it comes at a cost. You may find those glimpses linger, whispering echoes of impossible sights, and strange longings that you can't fully articulate. The silence will no longer seem so empty, and the darkness will hold a flicker of potential it never had before. The greatest danger of seeking out the liminal is that you open yourself to it, just as it opens to you. And now, having walked those edges, danced on the boundary of the unknown, I fear that a little piece of me will always remain there. The question haunts me. Once you cross certain thresholds, can you ever truly step back onto solid ground? I like to believe that my fascination is harmless, that my understanding of the liminal keeps me just far enough away from true danger. But sometimes, late at night, when the house creaks and the shadows seem to breathe on the edges of my vision, I worry I've opened a door that cannot be fully closed. Maybe that's the nature of liminality. We are forever changed by it. It leaves a residue on our souls. And even when we try to return to the comforting banality of the everyday, a part of us stays attuned to the whispers from those spaces in between. So, as you move through your world, I urge you, listen. Truly listen to the places others ignore, the neglected corners, the stretches of silence. You may hear nothing at all, proving my words nothing more than the ramblings of a woman with an overly vivid imagination. Or you might hear those faint echoes from the edge. If you do, proceed with caution, or turn and walk away, pretending for your own peace of mind that you hadn't heard them at all.
We hope you have enjoyed this episode of Quantum Dispatches, and stay tuned next week for another thrilling adventure. Thank you for listening.